There is a place in central Oklahoma between Shawnee and McLoud that seems to slip past memory like a whispered name in the wind. Elmridge isn't so much a town as it is a breath left behind by something older, something that doesn't care to be remembered. Its streets lie sunstruck and split, its sidewalks crumble along the edges, and its houses lean inward, as if listening for sounds they hope will never come. Dust clings to everything. The signs above the gas station and school gym are faded to the point of anonymity. The people move through their days with the quiet rhythm of obligation, not joy. There are no festivals here, no laughter that spills out onto porches, only routines, only silence, and not the kind that brings peace, but the kind that settles after a scream that no one heard. It was in one of these houses, crooked, timbered, and sagging behind the town's only bakery, that Ellie Jarrett was born. From the outside, the home looked like it was falling in on itself, and from the inside, it felt no different. Her mother, Sandra, was a tired woman. Her days were swallowed by steam, cooking oil, and crying toddlers at the kindergarten where she worked. When she came home, her clothes smelled of processed food and milk gone slightly sour. She didn't talk much. She didn't look much. Not at Ellie, not at anything for long. Her eyes had settled into the habit of looking past what hurt. It was survival, but it left Ellie feeling like a ghost in her own house. Her father, Roy, didn't work. He barely existed by day, slumped in a dented recliner, drinking from a chipped yellow mug with stains around the lip. He grumbled at the news, shouted at commercials, and fell asleep with the TV still buzzing. But at night, he came alive. He prowled the house like something waiting to erupt. Drawers were opened, doors slammed, cabinets pulled from their hinges, and always there was that muttering, constant, low, as if he was arguing with someone who was. But Ellie knew he wasn't looking for something lost. He was making room for the ugliness he carried inside him, trying to spill it into the walls. Ellie learned early how to read the signs. When his hands started twitching, rubbing at his own skin like he wanted to peel it off, she knew to go quiet. When he began pacing, the air thickened. It was like the pressure before a tornado, and she would hide under her bed or behind the door and hold her breath. She never screamed. Screaming meant nothing. He didn't hit with fists. He whispered. And in those whispers was something worse than violence. A calm that meant he had made up his mind. The first time it happened, she was 4. Sandra had taken a late shift, and Ellie was left alone with Roy. That night was strange in its simplicity. There was no drama, no threat, just a steady unfolding of silence. Ellie sat near the wall with her doll, the one with the scratched-out eyes, and watched him cross the room. He didn't say her name. He didn't look at her as someone who mattered. He picked her up like a pillow, carried her to the bedroom, and closed the door. His hands didn't shake. He smelled like sweat and beer. And what followed was something that would fracture time in her head into 2 parts, before and after. She didn't tell anyone, not because she was afraid of not being believed, but because she already knew no one would listen. Her mother came home and didn't notice anything unusual. No bruises, no blood. And that, in Elmridge, meant nothing happened. Ellie changed. Her voice grew quieter until it disappeared altogether. Her face became blank, unreadable. At kindergarten, she no longer joined games. She sat near the window and watched trees bend in the wind. When teachers commented on her silence, they called her thoughtful, a little shy. They didn't notice that she flinched at sudden movements, or that she never drew people, only shapes, enclosed spaces, black boxes. Sometimes she drew tiny windows with lines across them, like bars. No one asked her why. Miss Larry, one of the staff, called her a good girl. That meant Ellie didn't cry when scolded, didn't interrupt, didn't fight back. She obeyed. She was small and quiet, and that made her invisible. But Ellie saw everything. She saw how Miss Larry placed her hand on a boy's shoulder and leaned in too close. How another teacher rolled her eyes when a girl cried too loudly. She heard the word troublemaker said with a tired sigh and understood that pain could make people not care. Not because they were cruel, but because they were tired. In home, nothing improved. Roy's nightly rituals grew more erratic, more inventive. Sandra started sleeping on the couch. The rooms took on a stale smell of alcohol and silence. Ellie memorized the creaks in the floorboards, the rhythm of footsteps, the exact sound the refrigerator made before it hummed into life. These details were not trivial. They were warnings. One morning in class, while other children cut construction paper into hearts, Ellie drew a gas stove, then a pipe, then a curled hose, every detail accurate. The knobs, the color of the handle, the location of the main valve. Her hand did not shake. Her eyes remained fixed, unblinking. The teacher walking past thought she was just playing house. She wasn't. In the corner of the room, over the murmur of children and the rustle of paper, Ellie heard Miss Larry on the phone. The woman's voice was low but clear. "Roy is having another breakdown. Sandra's scared, but she has nowhere to go." There was a pause. "It's just the girl, you know? Just the girl." That phrase settled in Ellie's chest like a splinter. She realized, with a clarity that no child should ever have, that she was not someone anyone would save. She was not important enough to disrupt a routine, to cause discomfort, to start a fight. She was the one expected to survive quietly, to shrink herself smaller and smaller until she no longer cast a shadow, and in that moment, something inside her stopped bending. It began hardening. She stopped drawing houses. She began drawing maps, vents, pipes, windows that never opened. She began cataloging who left which doors unlocked, when the cleaners came, where the supply closets were, and which ones held tools. No one taught her to do this. No one needed to. It was instinct, the kind that grows in children who are forced to look at monsters and say nothing. This was not the beginning of Ellie's darkness. That had come long before. This was the beginning of something else. Not fear, not grief, understanding. She wasn't waiting for justice. She wasn't praying for rescue. She was watching, measuring, learning. The girl who once cried beneath a blanket now watched the sky through a frost-linked window and saw not stars, but exits, possibilities. The silence that once wrapped around her like a burial cloth had become something she could wear as armor. She would speak again one day, not in words, in action, in outcome. And when that day came, they would all remember her name, even if they had never really known her. Ellie turned 6 in January, and the cold that month clung to the town like a warning. It wasn't just winter. It was a sharper kind of stillness, a silence that pressed against the windows at night and crept through the cracks of the house during the day. The wind howled down the alley behind the bakery, scattering brittle branches and lifeless bags across the yard. Inside the house, the floor stayed cold no matter how long the space heater ran. Drafts cut across the hallway like knives. Everything seemed thinner that year. Walls, warmth, patience. Her birthday passed like any other day, indistinguishable in its absence of meaning. No balloons, no cake. Her mother came home late from work, her eyes hollow with fatigue, and without removing her coat, she shoved a half-stale donut from the previous morning onto a chipped plate. A candle was stuck in it sideways. She lit it, then stared somewhere past Ellie's shoulder as she mumbled a greeting that dissolved into the air. Her father didn't even acknowledge the date. He knocked over an empty beer can on his way to the door, muttered something under his breath, and left without closing it behind him. The cold rushed in. Ellie didn't move. She didn't blow out the candle. She didn't make a wish. She had stopped wishing for things a long time ago. Expectations were fragile in Elmridge. They cracked fast under the weight of repetition, of silence mistaken for safety, of indifference disguised as routine. Ellie had learned to protect herself not by speaking, not by running, but by folding inward. She built herself a shell, clear, hard, impermeable, and lived behind it like a creature watching a world that no longer acknowledged her presence. At school, they called her quiet, as if it was a compliment. They thought they understood her stillness. They saw a shy child, perhaps a little withdrawn, but manageable. They didn't see that she wasn't scared of them. She simply didn't trust them. The other children laughed at her clothes, poked fun at the way she sat perfectly still during story time, but she never reacted. Not a glance, not a word. They weren't real to her, not in the way danger was. Their noises were just echoes, distractions from the heavy truth that settled deeper each day inside her chest. Behind her silence was something vast and dark and long buried. It was the place inside her where fear lived. Cold, steady fear. Not the kind that made her cry, but the kind that made her remember everything, every detail, every smell, every whisper. And next to that fear, slowly and imperceptibly at first, something else had started to grow. It had no name, no shape, but it stirred. Like a slow ember under ash, and it burned more cleanly than pain. She didn't understand it until the day Ms. Larry took her to the shower in the kindergarten. It was cold outside. Their boots tracked slush through the hallways. Ellie had fallen during the walk back from the playground, her pants muddy, her legs red from the wind. Ms. Larry didn't yell. She never did. She just led her to the back room and began pulling off the wet clothing with the same practiced movements as always. But as she peeled off Ellie's pants, she said something. Her voice was smooth, clinical, almost kind. But the kindness was fake, hollowed out, a performance meant for no one. "You're quiet. Good girl. They leave the quiet ones alone." There was no affection in her tone. No humanity, just detached observation, like she was noting how well a chair had been dusted. Ellie didn't move, but something inside her shifted. A line was drawn, and for the first time, she saw it. The world was not made of good people and bad people. It was made of those who did and those who endured. And the line was invisible, but absolute. The quiet ones weren't protected. They were ignored, left alone, not in mercy, but in oversight. She returned home that evening to find her mother sitting in silence by the kitchen window. Smoke from her cigarette drifted in curls toward the cracked ceiling. There was a bruise on her neck, red and brown like rust. In the sink sat a bowl of water stained pink, with bits of gauze floating in it. Her mother said nothing. Ellie watched her clench her jaw so hard the muscle twitched. Nothing needed to be explained. Everything was already known. That night, lying in bed, Ellie didn't sleep. The blanket felt heavier than usual. The ceiling above her was cracked, and she stared at it until the darkness stopped feeling like night and started feeling like weight. She imagined the house crumbling inwards. She imagined the wind outside rushing in so fast it took everything with it. And she thought, not for the first time, but for the first time with clarity, what if this never changed? What if words meant nothing? What if help was a myth, a bedtime story for children who didn't live in places like Elmridge? There would be no police, no caseworkers, no teacher with a knowing glance. What there was her, just her, and the unbearable knowing that if something was to end, it would have to begin with her. In the morning, she went to the stove. The kitchen was empty, cold, quiet. She climbed up on a stool and examined the gas system, not with curiosity, but with intent. She traced the lines of the hose, felt the turn of the knob beneath her fingers. She remembered the time her father left it half open and her mother screamed about killing us all. The gas had a smell, yes, but not right away, not strong, not if the room stayed sealed. She imagined the air thickening, imagined the soundless fall of bodies, the peacefulness of it. Not violence, not panic, just silence. Final, pure. She didn't know what that meant yet, not fully. But something had taken root. That afternoon, back in kindergarten, Ellie watched Miss Larry lean down to whisper something to a boy named Trevor. He froze. The same way she had frozen once. His eyes widened. His shoulders shrank. When she pulled away, he immediately stood and walked to the sink to wash his hands. His movements were jerky, too fast, too ashamed. No one else noticed, but Ellie did. She saw it all, and it wasn't anger that filled her. It wasn't hate. It was something else, something colder, more exact, a certainty. She was done waiting. She was done enduring. That night, she stood by the window in her bedroom, the cold air rushing in through the frame she'd opened herself. The moonlight hit her face and made her skin look almost translucent. She held a tiny metal screw in her hand, taken from a broken toy car. It was nothing, useless, but it was solid, heavy, real. She clenched it tight and didn't let go. From that day forward, she stopped moving like a child. She didn't play. She didn't draw houses or suns. She began drawing schematics, vents, valves, layouts. She mapped out the school, the utility closet, the location of every radiator and fan. She memorized which teacher arrived first, who stayed late, and when the windows were opened, if ever. She noticed that the back ventilation system hadn't worked in months. She noticed that doors were sometimes left unlocked. She didn't fantasize. She calculated, and she didn't do it with malice. She did it with quiet resolve. Her world had told her exactly what she was. A girl meant to be quiet, to endure. But she no longer believed that. She was something else now, something sharpened. She began to build her plan, not out of emotion, but out of necessity, not for revenge, for release, for symmetry. No one saw it. No one even looked her in the eyes anymore, but if they had, they might have noticed that her silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence before something breaks. And once it did, there would be no sound, only aftermath. The plan did not emerge all at once. It was not a sudden burst of fury or desperation, but rather a slow and deliberate freezing, like ice crystallizing inside her mind, layer upon layer. While other children sang gleefully, played games under the warm sun, and colored their drawings with bright hues and carefree smiles, Ellie was different. Her eyes held no laughter, no innocence. Instead, they were sharp and observant, silently absorbing every detail of the world around her. She watched the teachers, especially Ms. Larry, as they carried out their daily rituals with mechanical precision. Ellie memorized how they inserted the key into the black ventilation box whenever the room needed airing. She took note of the comings and goings, who left and when, who arrived late, who stayed behind. The small shifts in their routines, the whispered conversations about who would stay late or leave early, became pieces in the complex puzzle she was assembling. This was not mere curiosity. It was a meticulous mapping of the environment she inhabited, an invisible blueprint crafted with care and patience. Mornings at the nursery began predictably. One teacher would arrive first, flick on the lights, survey the groups, and set the kettle to boil. Slowly, children would trickle in, filling the rooms with innocent chatter and laughter. By 9 o'clock, usually 9 people, 5 adults and 4 children, occupied the building. By 10, the number would swell to over 20. Yet Ellie knew exactly which day offered the best opportunity. It was Wednesday. Wednesdays were unique because Miss Larry was alone in the nursery group until almost 9. The other teachers had their reasons for arriving later, a child to care for, a late bus to catch. The kitchen remained deserted until just after 9, when the cook appeared to prepare breakfast. The old ventilation system, barely maintained, was intentionally neglected during cold mornings. Windows remained shut and stale, warm air settled heavily inside. Ellie understood the dangers of such conditions. A leak once occurred in her own home, her father's negligence almost costing them dearly. Her mother's frantic opening of every window that day and the sharp curses she uttered haunted Ellie's memory. Gas, she learned, carried a smell, but not immediately. It lingered, accumulating silently, especially in closed spaces without proper ventilation. Ellie began to practice, alone and unseen, in the quiet corners of her home. When her mother busied herself washing the floors and her father slumbered through his daytime haze, Ellie would slip quietly to the stove. She learned to turn on the gas burner without igniting a flame. Counting silently to 10, she familiarized herself with the subtle signs, the slow filling of the air with a faint odor, the moment the family cat would begin coughing, the second her mother's head would turn sharply toward the kitchen. These sessions were never daily, but carefully timed for moments when she knew no one would watch. Her movements were deliberate, her face serene, her eyes never wandering. At kindergarten, Ellie carried small items with her: paper clips, a gasless lighter, a piece of cardboard with a carefully drilled hole into which she fitted a small screw. To an outsider, these might have seemed like toys or random trinkets, but for Ellie, they were tools, part of her learning to adapt, to hide, to cover, to avoid attracting attention. The shadow in the corner of the room, unnoticed and unafraid. One day, Ellie discovered an old gas cylinder tucked away in the storage room beside the laundry. It bore a faded yellow sticker and had a metal tap rusted with neglect. During warmer months, the teachers used it for an outdoor kitchen, but now it stood forgotten, hidden behind stacked boxes. Tracing the backup hose attached to the cylinder, Ellie followed its path beneath loose panels and into the ventilation system. She recognized it as a potential route, a quiet, deadly way to release gas into the building unnoticed. For a full week, she observed the security of the tap and the latches that restrained it. She assessed the effort required to open it, rehearsing silently in her mind, wiping every surface she touched with damp cloths to avoid leaving fingerprints or traces. Ellie moved invisibly through the nursery. No one noticed her presence. After all, she was Ellie, the child who did not cry, did not argue, did not demand. A mere shadow blending into the background, harmless and ignored. But shadows can be cold, and their chill can freeze even the warmest of rooms. Returning home one afternoon, Ellie overheard her mother speaking in a low voice on the phone, her words carrying the weight of dread. The girl is silent, no longer a child in her demeanor. She seems to be plotting something, but no one knows what. Ellie paused at the doorway and allowed herself the faintest, unreadable smile. Not joy, but a premonition of what was to come. With the decisiveness that only comes from years of silent suffering, Ellie selected the day for her plan. It would be Friday morning, when the nursery would be filled with the loudest, most boisterous children, those who patted her shoulder without permission, who ignored Miss Larry's gentle touches on her back, who believed kindness meant forcing a smile upon the unwilling. It was not an act of revenge, Ellie plotted, but an end. An end to the pain that had begun on a night years ago, an end left unfinished by those too afraid or unwilling to act. Ellie did not hurry or act impulsively. Her plan was measured, as cold and steady as the ice that had encased her heart. No one would finish what had been left undone. If justice was not given, she would claim it herself. The child who had learned to live in silence was now prepared to shatter it forever. That morning in Elmridge began with the brittle chill of February seeping into every corner of the small town. The frost clung to the cracked sidewalks and curled around the bare branches of the oaks, while the weak winter sun struggled to warm the worn bricks of the kindergarten building. Ice glazed the roads, prompting the delayed opening of the nursery that day. The usual bustle of voices and footsteps was muted by the cold as teachers shuffled in, brushing snow from their boots and exchanging tense smiles over steaming plastic cups branded with Elmridge First Kids. Ellie, as she did every morning, stood by the window with her faded stuffed rabbit tucked into one arm. Her presence was barely noticeable, her movements unobtrusive and quiet. She lingered just far enough away from the adults and children, not drawn in, but not fully apart either. It was a poised stillness, as if her body was there, but her mind was somewhere else, focused, calculated, intent. At precisely 7:50 AIE MIM, Miss Larry unlocked the utility room, the same room where an old, forgotten gas tank sat tucked behind stacks of cleaning supplies. Her task was simple: fetch a rag to wipe down the dusty windowsills. Ellie trailed just a step behind, silent and unseen. She knew the gas tap's stubborn stiffness well, but the previous days of meticulous observation and careful tampering had loosened it. With a single, smooth motion, she turned the valve. The gas hissed softly into the connected hose, clear, heavy, and deadly in its invisibility. The air inside the room thickened imperceptibly as the invisible poison began its slow spread. Ellie quietly shut the door and returned to her chair, folding her small hands neatly in her lap. The old ventilation system in the nursery was still broken. Windows remained tightly closed against the morning chill because the teachers feared drafts. The air conditioners wouldn't hum to life until closer to midday, when the sunlight finally warmed the glass. The kitchen's extraction hood on the first floor only switched on with the cook's arrival after 9 o'clock. All the conditions Ellie had mapped out and memorized fell precisely into place. Nothing stood in the way of her plan. At 8:12, the first sign of distress appeared. Miss Larry winced, attempting to open a window to let in fresh air, only to close it moments later with a shiver. The cold outside was biting and unwelcome. A child complained of a sudden headache. Another boy collapsed onto the carpet, murmuring a desire to sleep. The early symptoms seemed almost trivial, even comical. But by 8:24, the situation escalated rapidly. Miss Brooks, a young trainee teacher, began to cough violently. Her eyes reddened and her voice broke into a harsh wheeze. She mistook her symptoms for a cold and intended to leave for fresh air, but barely made it to the door before staggering and collapsing onto the floor. tea spilling from her hands. Miss Larry rushed to her aid, but her own complexion had drained to an ashen gray, the first clear sign that something far worse was unfolding. The children's cries did not burst out in frantic screams but emerged as long, gasping sobs, a drawn-out struggle for breath. One small boy, Mikey, crumpled unconscious onto the floor. The nursery had transformed into a tableau of stillness and slow motion, the thickening air folding around them like smoke in a suffocating fog. At 8:31, Ellie remained still, unmoved by the mounting chaos. She felt the air grow heavier, her own head spinning slightly, but kept a silent count in her mind, to 50, to 80, timing herself with a calm precision that belied her age. Her eyes stayed open, watching as the others succumbed, one by one, to the invisible threat. By 8:38, the entire first floor lay motionless. Miss Larry's body slid silently from her chair, her head resting on the floor amidst scattered plastic toys. The cook, arriving late as per the usual schedule, stumbled at the kitchen doorway and collapsed, without understanding the horror that had overtaken the building. Ellie rose with slow deliberation, her movements fluid and eerily detached, as if moving through water. She passed silently among the sleeping children and the abandoned tables still bearing remnants of breakfast. There was no trace left behind. No notes, no toys, no farewells. Only the heavy air, now saturated with the stillness of death. She opened the window in the stairwell and stepped out into the biting frost. The cold struck her face sharply, but she did not flinch or hesitate. With quiet resolve, she closed the door behind her and disappeared into the morning's icy embrace. At 9:04, a late-arriving teacher approached the building and noticed the second-floor window wide open. Inside, the nursery was engulfed in an unnatural silence, a silence that, when it surrounds children, carries a terrible weight. Emergency services soon arrived. Ambulances, police, fire crews, followed by reporters eager to document the tragedy. Newspapers filled with headlines screaming of a disaster. Tragedy in Elmridge, 22 dead in nursery incident. The official narrative suggested a gas leak, an accident, a catastrophic failure in the system. A systemic error that no one could have foreseen. Amid the chaos and investigation, the presence of one small girl went unnoticed. Ellie was not among the list of casualties. She was absent from the security footage, some of which had mysteriously malfunctioned during the night. Her name did not appear in any official records or reports. Yet, in a quiet corner of the hospital, a nurse poring over the list of names whispered a question that reverberated with chilling implication. Where is Ellie Jarrett? Within that simple question lay the horror no one dared to face. The realization that the tragedy was not just an accident or a malfunction, but something far darker. The girl who stood silently by the window every morning, who was seen but never truly noticed, had vanished. And in her disappearance lay the unspoken truth of the devastation she had wrought, and the silence that had allowed it. The first hours after the tragedy in Elmridge unfolded in a strange and unsettling manner, a chaos tinged with disbelief and confusion rather than frantic action. The small town seemed to struggle with how to respond to such an unfathomable loss. The police swiftly cordoned off the kindergarten building, setting up yellow tape barriers that glowed harshly in the pale winter light. Medics moved silently, carrying the bodies of the victims wrapped in white bags, their weight heavy with finality and sorrow. Parents gathered on the icy steps outside the building, tears streaming, faces etched with shock, unable to accept that every single person inside had perished. 22 souls lost, 16 children and 6 adults, a number that felt almost impossible to comprehend, especially in a town where life moved at the slow, deliberate pace of meltwater running through muddy ditches. Amid the overwhelming grief and confusion, suspicion naturally fell on the gas. Investigators descended on the building, examining the kitchen and the ventilation systems for signs of a leak or malfunction. Surprisingly, they found the main gas cylinder in the kitchen had been disconnected, completely detached from the system. The backup cylinder, an old relic long unused and forgotten in the storage room, was found empty. More disturbingly, its hose had been deliberately connected to the ventilation shafts, not in any official or professional capacity, but with the deliberate intent of channeling gas into the building's air circulation. This was no accident. Someone had taken the time and care to ensure the gas would spread silently, unseen and unchecked. Even as they pored over the surveillance footage from the kindergarten, technicians reported a glaring absence. The video recording from that tragic Friday morning was missing. Equipment malfunction, they said, overheated cameras. A coincidence or something more sinister? The townsfolk whispered dark possibilities, but no one dared speak too loudly. The town was gripped by a collective unease. The authorities quickly compiled a list of the victims. It was precise, clinical, but then a troubling discrepancy emerged when one officer cross-referenced attendance records. A girl named Ellie Jarrett was listed as present that morning, yet her body was nowhere to be found. Not among the deceased, not anywhere in the immediate vicinity. Nowhere at all. Her absence sparked a silent alarm, one that was slow to ignite but impossible to ignore. Back at home, Ellie's room told no tales of struggle or flight. Her bed was neatly made, toys arranged as if untouched, the quiet order of a place left behind rather than abandoned. Yet in the bottom drawer of the dresser, Sandra Jarrett, Ellie's mother, discovered something that chilled her more than the winter air. A plastic timer, an old schematic card detailing the ventilation layout of the kindergarten building, and a note written in a child's handwriting but with an unsettling certainty. The single word inscribed was goodbye. Sandra's call to the police was tinged with exhaustion and resignation. When asked if she had known anything, she whispered, "Nothing. I hadn't looked at her for a long time. I was afraid." Her words encapsulated the heavy silence that had enveloped the family and the town alike. The search for Ellie began in earnest. Flyers were plastered on every lamppost and bulletin board. News reports aired her picture and details. Lists of missing children circulated, and search efforts employed drones and dogs scouring the outskirts of Elmridge. Yet no trace of Ellie was ever found. Cameras along the highways showed no sign of her departure. No witnesses recalled seeing her leave or speaking to anyone that day. Psychologists speculated on her disappearance, labeling it a post-traumatic breakdown triggered by years of domestic abuse. The newspapers mourned the silent child who became a ghost. Some speculated she had drowned in the nearby river. Others feared she had been taken, perhaps used in something far worse. But beneath these official theories lurked a darker, unspoken suspicion. Families who had lost children began to connect threads, recalling how they had admonished Ellie in small ways. "Stop staring. Don't stand so close. Don't touch my toys." No one had seen her as a threat, just a quiet, overlooked child. Now many felt a gnawing unease, as though they had passed by something terrible and failed to notice. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, months into a year. Ellie's body remained missing. The investigation was quietly closed, and the kindergarten was shuttered, its windows boarded, and the doors locked away. The local newspaper, the Oklahoma Observer, published a haunting editorial. "This is not just a tragedy, it is a mirror. We look into it and do not recognize our reflection." Sandra Jarrett vanished from town soon after, leaving no forwarding address or contact. No one saw her again. The Jarrett family home was demolished, the lot purchased by an unknown buyer who never built anything on it. Ellie herself seemed to dissolve into the cold February mornings of that fateful day. Years later, a lone child's shoe, identical to one seen in old photographs of Ellie, was found discarded by the side of the highway heading north. But the shoe was empty, devoid of its owner, like a shell left behind. Since that day, Elmridge's residents have never spoken openly of that Friday. The name Ellie Jarrett has become taboo, whispered only in half-remembered stories and quiet fears. Those who know the tales say that Ellie did not seek revenge. She became a reminder, a chilling testament that silence is not always harmless, and that sometimes the quietest voices carry the heaviest weight. Elmridge had always been a town marked by quiet routines and muted landscapes, where the slow passage of time was measured more by the changing seasons than by any grand events. Its streets were lined with worn bricks and aging trees, and the lives of its residents moved at a subdued pace, touched by the weight of history and unspoken sorrows. Yet after that bitter winter morning, the day when the kindergarten fell silent forever, the nature of the town's silence transformed into something far heavier and more suffocating. It became thick and stagnant, like the stale, musty air trapped within the walls of a long-forgotten basement, pressing down on every soul and corner with an unnatural heaviness. It was as though the very earth beneath Elmridge no longer wished to hear the murmurs, cries, or whispers of its people. The tragedy of that day was never spoken aloud in public spaces. There were no memorials erected in the town square, no plaques affixed to the walls of the former kindergarten, no gatherings to read the names of the lost children and adults. The event was treated almost like an illness, one that the townsfolk believed might be cured by collective silence and deliberate forgetfulness. But the sickness was not so easily banished. Instead, it took root deeper beneath the surface, infecting the town's collective memory with a quiet dread that simmered beneath the everyday comings and goings. 2 years after the incident, a parking lot was installed on the site where the kindergarten once stood. Officially, this was described as a temporary measure, a practical solution to the town's needs. But even this change was met with an unspoken weariness. The lot remained strangely empty near its edges, especially close to the boarded-up walls that once housed laughter and life. Rumors began to circulate among the townspeople, stories of vehicles inexplicably failing to start, of streetlights flickering erratically without cause, and of a chill that would unexpectedly slide down the backs of passers-by on cold, quiet evenings. The air itself seemed charged with an unseen presence. Some claimed to have glimpsed a figure near the fence bordering the lot, a girl dressed in a long coat and a knitted hat, standing utterly still, as though guarding a secret or waiting silently for something long past. No one dared to approach. The figure, whether real or imagined, became a spectral reminder of the town's wounds. Within the schools, there was a subtle but perceptible shift. Psychological counselors were brought in more frequently to speak with students, and teachers were encouraged to engage more attentively with their pupils, to meet their gazes and listen more carefully. But these actions often felt mechanical, perfunctory gestures performed out of fear of a recurrence rather than genuine understanding or compassion. Adults learned to be watchful, but not necessarily kinder. Parents held their children close, wary of the unknown, yet conversations remained surface level, lacking in the depth that might have bridged emotional distances. When new teachers arrived in Elmridge, they were warned, quietly and briefly, there was something here. Just don't ask questions. The name Ellie Jarrett faded from official records and was replaced in police files with the sterile designation, unidentified person, missing without trace. Her photograph vanished from archives within 3 years, whether by accident or design no one could say. Yet, her image lingered vividly in the town's shared consciousness, particularly among children and adolescents. High schoolers whispered tales to younger students. If you misbehave and think no one's watching, she might come. She sees everything. Ellie was no longer merely a missing girl. She had become a legend, a symbol far more potent than any person. She was no longer just a victim or a memory. She was an omen, a threat, a dark guardian of silence and reckoning. Stories about Ellie grew in detail and imagination. Some claimed she had the power to shut off gas valves with a glance. Others swore she moved unseen among them, silently reminding the town that evil left unpunished never truly vanished. Her presence permeated whispered fears and secret hopes alike. Among girls in particular, Ellie's name began to appear in diaries, not as a friend, but as a plea for protection, a charm against the unknown. No adult sought to dissuade them, perhaps understanding that some mysteries could neither be explained nor erased. 5 years passed, then 10. Elmridge continued to exist, stubbornly clinging to its slow rhythms and time-worn customs. The sun still rose and set on its sleepy streets, but something had irrevocably changed. The town's gaze had sharpened, focusing more intently on the quiet, the withdrawn, the children who once might have been overlooked or dismissed as strange. These silent ones no longer provoked irritation but invited anxious suspicion. What hidden storms brewed beneath their quiet facades? What silences shielded Every time a voice attempted to soothe with the phrase, "It's just a child," there was always a whispered counter, "Exactly." Ellie Jarrett's silence had transcended its origin. It was no longer a mere absence of sound, but a presence in itself, an icy reminder cast across the town like frost on a window pane. Not a scream nor an accusation, but a clear, chilling message. If you do not listen, if you ignore the quiet pain beneath the surface, one day you may find yourself suffocating in the very silence you chose to accept.